Arizona Territory, 1878. The unforgiving frontier stretched before Jake Turner like an ocean of dust and broken promises. At 26, he had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The merciless sun beat down as he guided his horse along the edge of the painted desert, his young face weathered beyond its years beneath the wide brim of his tan cowboy hat. "Easy, Ranger," he murmured to his Palomino stallion as they navigated a treacherous slope. The horse's ears flicked back at the sound of his master's voice, but Jake's thoughts were elsewhere. 3 years since the Apache raid that had claimed his parents' lives, and still he wandered, taking odd jobs on ranches across the territory, never staying long enough to form attachments. Jake's entire life had been reduced to the essentials: his horse, his Colt revolver, and the unshakable belief that a man survived the frontier by relying on no one but himself. Love was a luxury that got people killed out here, where nature and man competed to see which could be more ruthless. A hawk circled overhead, its lonely cry echoing Jake's solitary existence. His lean, muscular frame shifted in the saddle as he squinted at the horizon. 2 more days to Willow Creek if the weather held. The cattle drive payment in his pocket would sustain him for a while, but eventually he'd need to find more work. That was life on the frontier, an endless cycle of survival with no real destination. As the sun began its descent behind the painted mesas, Jake made camp beside a small stream, one of the few water sources in this parched land. He unsaddled Ranger, brushed him down, and set about the familiar routine of building a small fire. The dancing flames cast shadows across his handsome features, the strong jaw, straight nose, and clear green eyes that rarely revealed his thoughts. Jake sipped bitter coffee from a tin cup and stared into the flames. In the morning, he would continue his journey to nowhere in particular. That was how he survived the guilt and grief that had haunted him since the raid. Keep moving, trust no one, depend only on yourself. The frontier was no place for dreams of home and hearth; those were for people who hadn't seen what he had seen. The snap of a twig in the darkness froze him mid-sip. His hand moved instinctively to his holster as he rose to his feet in one fluid motion, drawing his revolver with practiced ease. "Show yourself," he called, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. For a long moment, only the crackling of his campfire and the chirp of crickets answered him. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her hands raised slightly to show she carried no weapon. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady for someone staring down the barrel of a gun. "I saw your fire from a distance." Jake kept his revolver trained on her as she stepped into the circle of firelight, and what he saw caused his breath to catch. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with striking features framed by long, dark brown hair that cascaded in waves past her shoulders. Her simple blue calico dress was dusty from travel but well-made, and she carried a small leather satchel. "What's a woman doing out here alone?" Jake demanded, not lowering his weapon. Beautiful women in the wilderness usually meant trouble in his experience, either outlaws using them as bait or Eastern ladies who'd gotten themselves hopelessly lost. "I might ask what a man is doing out here alone," she countered, her deep blue eyes meeting his without flinching. "But I suspect the answer is similar to mine, traveling." Something in her composure made Jake lower his gun slightly, though he didn't holster it. "Traveling to where?" "Willow Creek." Jake's eyes narrowed. That's a fair distance through dangerous country, no escort, no wagon. "I had a horse," she replied, a flash of anger crossing her face. "It was stolen 2 days ago while I slept. I've been walking since." Against his better judgment, Jake felt a twinge of admiration. 2 days on foot in this terrain was no small feat, especially for a city woman, and everything about her manner of speech and bearing suggested Eastern origins. "What's your name?" he asked, finally holstering his weapon. Willow Edwards," she hesitated before adding, "and yours?" "Jake Turner," he gestured to the fire. "You're welcome to warm yourself. I've got coffee and some beans left from supper." Relief washed across her face, though she clearly tried to hide it. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." Jake watched as she settled beside the fire, accepting the tin plate of beans he offered with genuine gratitude. She ate with surprising restraint for someone who must have been famished after 2 days with limited provisions. "What takes you to Willow Creek?" he asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. Willow hesitated, and Jake saw something guarded pass behind her eyes. A fresh start, she said finally. I have an arrangement to teach at the new school there. Jake nodded, though something told him she wasn't sharing the whole truth. Not that he blamed her, the frontier was built on reinvention, on people fleeing their pasts. He'd done his share of that himself. I'm headed there myself, he said. You're welcome to ride with me in the morning. Ranger can carry 2 for a day or so. Surprise and suspicion flickered across her face. Why would you offer that to a stranger? Jake shrugged, because leaving a woman alone in Apache territory would be a death sentence, and I don't need that on my conscience. He paused. But make no mistake, Miss Edwards, once we reach Willow Creek we go our separate ways. I'm not looking for complications. Something like amusement curved the corners of her mouth. I assure you, Mr. Turner, complications are the very thing I'm trying to escape. As the fire burned low, Jake offered her his bedroll and took first watch. Sitting with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his knees, he studied his unexpected companion in the dying firelight. Willow Edwards was a puzzle. Her speech and manners suggested education and privilege, yet here she was, alone in one of the most dangerous territories in the West. More importantly, she was a liability. Attachments got people killed out here. Jake had learned that lesson the hard way, watching his father die trying to protect his mother during the raid. Caring for others was a weakness the frontier exploited without mercy. Yet as dawn broke over the painted mesas, casting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Jake found himself strangely unsettled by the woman sleeping peacefully by his fire. There was something about her, a quiet strength perhaps, that didn't fit his notion of Eastern fragility. What he didn't know, as he saddled Ranger and prepared for the day's journey, was that Willow Edwards would challenge everything he believed about survival on the frontier and about his own heart's capacity to heal. The morning sun had barely risen when Jake gently shook Willow awake. She startled, her eyes wide with momentary panic before recognition set in. Time to move, Jake said, already packing his few belongings. We've got ground to cover. Willow nodded, quickly folding the bedroll and handing it to him. Jake noticed she moved with efficiency, without the helplessness he'd expected from a woman of her background. She splashed water from his canteen on her face and smoothed her hair, transforming herself from a trail-worn traveler to something closer to the schoolteacher she claimed to be. Thank you for the shelter last night, she said, accepting a piece of hardtack for breakfast. Jake merely nodded, leading Ranger toward her. I'll mount first, then pull you up behind me. Once settled in the saddle with Willow behind him, Jake nudged Ranger forward. He was acutely aware of her hands resting lightly on his waist, maintaining the minimum contact necessary to stay mounted. He appreciated her restraint. Many women would have clutched him tightly at the first trot. How long have you been in the territory? He asked as they navigated a shallow wash. There was a pause before Willow answered. 6 weeks. I came west by train, then stagecoach. Quite a change from the east. You assume I'm from the east. Jake glanced over his shoulder with a raised eyebrow. Am I wrong? A small smile played at her lips. No, Boston originally, though I spent the last 5 years in Philadelphia. Teaching, among other things. Her evasiveness confirmed Jake's suspicion that she was running from something. Not that it was his concern. They would reach Willow Creek tomorrow, and she would become someone else's problem. They rode in companionable silence for several hours, the landscape gradually shifting from painted desert to rolling grasslands dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest and water Ranger. As Jake refilled his canteen, he watched Willow from the corner of his eye. She had removed her boots to dangle her feet in the creek, her face tilted up to catch the sun. For a moment, with her guard down, she looked younger, almost carefree. How old are you, Miss Edwards? He asked before he could stop himself. She turned, surprise evident in her expression. 23, she answered. And yourself? 26, he said, recapping the canteen, though most days I feel much older. Willow nodded, her eyes suddenly distant. The frontier ages us all, I suppose. There was something in her tone that made Jake wonder what had driven this young, educated woman to the harshness of the Arizona territory. Boston ladies didn't generally seek out teaching positions in frontier towns unless they were fleeing something worse. We should keep moving, he said, pushing the thought aside. Her secrets were her own. As Willow pulled her boots back on, Jake noticed a small medallion that had slipped from beneath her collar, a silver pendant on a thin chain. She quickly tucked it away, but not before he glimpsed what appeared to be a family crest. The afternoon brought gathering clouds and the distant rumble of thunder. Jake pushed Ranger harder, hoping to reach a line shack he knew was several miles ahead before the storm broke. Willow remained silent behind him, but he could feel her tension as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "There's shelter ahead," he called over his shoulder as rain pelted them with increasing ferocity. By the time they reached the abandoned line shack, they were both soaked through. Jake dismounted quickly, helping Willow down before leading Ranger to the lean-to attached to the small cabin. The shack was dusty but intact, with a small stone fireplace, a rickety table with one chair, and a narrow cot. Jake busied himself lighting a fire while Willow wrung water from her hair and skirts. "You should change into something dry," he said, not looking at her. "I'll see to Ranger." When he returned from tending to his horse, Jake found Willow standing by the fire in a simple gray dress, her wet clothing spread nearby to dry. Her damp hair hung loose around her shoulders, catching the firelight in auburn highlights he hadn't noticed before. "I have some jerky and hardtack," he offered, shrugging out of his wet coat and hanging it by the door. "Thank you," she said, taking a seat on the edge of the cot. "For everything. I'm not sure I would have survived another night out there alone." Jake nodded uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Willow said quietly, "they wouldn't have. Most men would have either left me to my fate or demanded payment for their assistance." The implication hung in the air between them. Jake busied himself with preparing their meager meal, aware that she was studying him with those perceptive blue eyes. "What brought you to the frontier, Mr. Turner?" she asked finally. "You don't strike me as a drifter by nature." Jake stiffened. "That's a story not worth telling." "Everyone's story is worth telling," she countered gently, "especially out here where tomorrow isn't guaranteed." Perhaps it was the storm raging outside, or the unusual intimacy of sharing the small space, but Jake found himself speaking words he'd kept buried for years. "I came west with my parents 10 years ago. They established a small ranch north of here. 3 years ago, Apache raiders attacked while I was away delivering cattle to the fort." He stared into the fire. "I buried what was left of them when I returned." Willow's face softened with genuine sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Jake." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and somehow it broke something loose inside him. "I should have been there," he said roughly. "Maybe I could have saved them." "Or died alongside them," Willow pointed out. "Fate sent you away that day." Jake gave a bitter laugh. "I don't believe in fate, Miss Edwards. Only choices and consequences. And your choice since has been to wander." "My choice has been to survive." Jake met her gaze directly. "Attachments are dangerous out here. People who put down roots, who let themselves care too much about others, they're vulnerable. I won't make that mistake again." Willow regarded him thoughtfully. "That sounds terribly lonely." "Better lonely than dead," he replied, handing her a portion of jerky. "Or worse, responsible for someone else's death." They ate in silence after that, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. Despite his discomfort with personal revelations, Jake found himself wondering about the circumstances that had brought this woman to the frontier. There was a sadness behind her composure, a watchfulness that spoke of experiences beyond teaching schoolchildren. As night fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Jake spread his bedroll on the floor. "You take the cot," he said, removing his boots. "We'll head out at first light if the weather clears." Willow nodded, settling onto the narrow cot. "Good night, Mr. Turner. And thank you for sharing your story with me." Jake merely grunted, turning his back to her as he stretched out on his bedroll. But sleep eluded him, his mind filled with memories he'd tried for years to suppress, and questions about the mysterious woman who had unexpectedly entered his life. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the small cabin, something subtle had shifted between two strangers brought together by chance on the unforgiving frontier. Dawn brought clearing skies and the gentle aftermath of the storm. Jake woke to find Willow already up, her hair neatly braided, heating coffee over the rekindled fire. "You're up early," he observed, sitting up and running a hand through his tousled hair. She offered a small smile. "Old habits. I rarely sleep past dawn." As they prepared to depart, Jake found himself watching Willow with growing curiosity. She moved with practiced efficiency, helping to saddle Ranger without being asked. Whatever her past, she had adapted to frontier life with remarkable resilience. They reached the outskirts of Willow Creek by mid-afternoon. The town had grown since Jake's last visit, new buildings lined the main street, and a proper church spire rose above the rooftops. Progress had come to the frontier, though Jake noted with cynical amusement that the saloon still appeared to be the busiest establishment. "Where should I take you?" he asked as they rode down the main street. "The schoolhouse, please," Willow replied. "It should be near the church." Jake nodded, guiding Ranger toward the north end of town. The schoolhouse was a modest wooden structure with fresh white paint and a small bell tower. As they approached, a middle-aged woman emerged from the building, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "You must be Miss Edwards," she called, walking toward them. "We'd begun to worry." Jake dismounted and helped Willow down, feeling suddenly awkward. Their journey together was ending just as he'd intended, yet he found himself strangely reluctant to part ways. "Mrs. Cooper?" Willow asked, stepping forward with her small satchel. "Indeed, and you're right on time for the start of term next week." Mrs. Cooper's curious gaze shifted to Jake. "And this is?" "Mr. Turner," Willow said. "He kindly escorted me after my horse was stolen." Mrs. Cooper's expression warmed. "How fortunate. Well, Mr. Turner, the town of Willow Creek is grateful for your assistance. Miss Edwards comes highly recommended from back east." Jake nodded uncomfortably, just happened to be traveling the same direction. "Well, Miss Edwards, let me show you to your accommodations," Mrs. Cooper said, taking Willow's arm. "You'll be staying with Reverend Johnson and his wife until we can arrange more permanent housing." Willow turned to Jake, her expression composed but her eyes conveying something deeper. "Thank you again for your help, Mr. Turner." "I'm in your debt." Jake shifted his weight, strangely reluctant to end their acquaintance. "No debt, Miss Edwards. Safe travels wouldn't have meant much if I'd left you to the elements." A small smile touched her lips. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful. Perhaps our paths will cross again." "Perhaps," Jake replied, though he doubted it. Once he resupplied, he'd be moving on. Willow Creek was getting too civilized for his taste, and he had no interest in watching Willow Edwards settle into her new life among these townspeople. As Mrs. Cooper led Willow away, Jake stood for a moment, absently stroking Ranger's neck. There was something about Willow that had gotten under his skin, a quiet strength and mystery that intrigued him despite his determination to remain detached. With a shake of his head, Jake mounted Ranger and headed toward the general store. He needed supplies and perhaps a drink at the saloon before finding a place to camp outside town. Tomorrow he would move on as he always did. But as he tied Ranger outside the general store, Jake found himself glancing toward the schoolhouse, where Willow had disappeared with Mrs. Cooper. For the first time in years, the prospect of riding away alone left him with an unfamiliar emptiness. 2 weeks later, Jake still hadn't left Willow Creek. He'd taken a temporary job at the livery stable, telling himself it was just to earn enough money for new supplies before moving on. In reality, he found himself lingering in town, catching glimpses of Willow as she established herself as the town's new schoolteacher. From a distance, he observed how quickly she integrated into the community, attending church services, organizing the schoolhouse, and winning over the town's children with her gentle but firm manner. She seemed perfectly suited to her role, yet occasionally Jake caught a flash of something else. A wariness when strangers arrived in town, a tendency to scan her surroundings as if looking for potential threats. It was on a warm Saturday afternoon that chance brought them face to face again. Jake was returning a repaired bridle to its owner when he literally bumped into Willow outside the mercantile. "Mr. Turner," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I thought you would be long gone by now." Jake shifted uncomfortably, took on some work at the livery, just temporary. She smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Well, it's good to see you. How are you finding Willow Creek?" "It's growing," he replied neutrally. "You seem to be settling in well." "The children are wonderful," she said, her eyes lighting up. 23 students now, ages 6 to 15. Some ride in from 5 miles out. Jake found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "You were born to teach, it seems." A shadow crossed her face briefly. "Perhaps. It gives me purpose, at least." She hesitated. I'm having a small gathering for some of the students and their parents tomorrow afternoon, a picnic by the creek. You would be welcome to join us. The invitation caught Jake off guard. I'm not much for social gatherings. I understand, Willow said, disappointment flashing briefly in her eyes. The offer stands nonetheless, around 2 o'clock just past the old cottonwood. Before Jake could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. A man stumbled out, clearly drunk despite the early hour, shouting obscenities. Jake instinctively stepped between Willow and the disturbance. The drunk man staggered into the street, his bloodshot eyes fixing on them. Well, if it ain't the fancy new schoolmarm, he slurred. Too good for the likes of us common folk, ain't ya? Jake felt Willow tense behind him. Move along, mister, he said firmly. The lady doesn't want any trouble. The drunk sneered. Lady, that what she told you, he spat in the dirt. Ask her about Philadelphia, ask her about. Before he could finish, 2 men emerged from the saloon and grabbed him by the arms. Sorry about that, Miss Edwards, one called. Harlan's had too much whiskey, we'll get him home. Jake turned to find Willow pale as a ghost, her composed demeanor shattered. Willow, what was that about? Nothing, she said quickly. Just a drunk making trouble. She clutched her parcels tighter. I should go, the offer for tomorrow still stands. Before Jake could press further, she hurried away, leaving him standing in the street with more questions than answers. Whatever secret Willow Edwards was hiding, it had followed her to Willow Creek. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself at the picnic spot the following afternoon. He stood at a distance, watching as Willow organized games for the children while their parents spread blankets and unpacked food. She wore a pale yellow dress that caught the sunlight, and her hair was partially pinned up, with loose curls framing her face. She spotted him and waved, excusing herself from the group to approach him. You came, she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. Just passing by, Jake lied, uncomfortable with the admission that he had deliberately sought her out. Willow smiled, seeing through his pretense. Well, since you're passing by, perhaps you'd like some lemonade. Before he could decline, a young girl of about 8 ran up to them. Miss Edwards, Jimmy says girls can't throw as far as boys, but I know I can throw farther than him. Willow laughed, a free and unguarded sound that caught Jake by surprise. Well, Abigail, perhaps we should have a contest and settle this once and for all. She glanced at Jake. Mr. Turner, would you be willing to judge a throwing competition? I fear I might be biased in Abigail's favor. Somehow Jake found himself dragged into the children's games, measuring throwing distances and adjudicating disputes with unexpected enjoyment. The children's straightforward enthusiasm was refreshing after years of adult cynicism and caution. As the afternoon waned, Jake found himself seated beside Willow on a blanket, watching the children play by the creek under their parents' supervision. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. The children enjoyed having a real cowboy judge their contests. Jake shrugged. They're good kids. Yes, they are, Willow hesitated. Jake, about yesterday. You don't owe me any explanations, he interrupted. Everyone out here is running from something. She studied him for a long moment, even you. Especially me. He plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. But I've been running so long, I'm not sure I know how to stop. I understand that feeling, Willow admitted, her voice barely audible over the children's laughter. Sometimes I think we spend so much time looking over our shoulders that we forget to look ahead. Their eyes met, and Jake felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared experience despite their different backgrounds. The moment was broken by shouts of alarm from downstream. They both leapt to their feet as parents began calling frantically for their children. A boy had fallen into the creek at a deep point and was being swept away by the current, still swollen from recent rains. Without hesitation, Jake sprinted toward the water, throwing off his hat and gun belt as he ran. He plunged into the creek, strong strokes carrying him toward the struggling child. The current was fiercer than it looked, pulling at his clothes and threatening to drag him under. Jake reached the boy, Jimmy, the one who had challenged Abigail to the throwing contest, and grabbed him around the chest. I've got you, he gasped as the boy clung to him in panic. Stop struggling and let me swim. Fighting against the current, Jake managed to angle them toward the shore, where parents and children watched in horror. As they neared the bank, he felt himself tiring, the weight of the boy and his waterlogged clothes dragging him down. Suddenly, Willow was there, wading into the water with no regard for her yellow dress. She reached for Jimmy, pulling him to safety before extending her hand to Jake. Together, they staggered onto the shore, collapsing on the grass as relieved parents surrounded them. Jimmy's mother gathered her son into her arms, weeping with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she sobbed. "Thank you for saving my boy." Jake, still catching his breath, merely nodded. The rush of the moment was fading, leaving him acutely aware of Willow beside him, her dress soaked and clinging to her slender frame, her hair falling in wet tangles around her face. Despite her bedraggled appearance, she was smiling at him with something like wonder. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," she said softly. Jake felt strangely embarrassed by her praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she insisted, echoing her words from the line shack. "They wouldn't have." As the picnic broke up, parents hurrying to get their children home and into dry clothes, Jake found himself walking Willow back to town. They were both damp and disheveled, but the shared experience had created a bond that neither could deny. "You risked your life for that boy," Willow said as they neared the outskirts of town. "For a child you barely knew." Jake frowned. "I couldn't just watch him drown." "Exactly, despite all your talk about not getting attached, about surviving by staying alone, when it mattered, you chose to risk everything for someone else." She stopped, turning to face him. "That doesn't sound like a man who believes connections are a weakness." Jake had no answer for her. The truth was, he hadn't thought at all before diving into the creek. He'd simply acted on instinct, the same instinct that had kept him lingering in Willow Creek long after he should have moved on. "I should get you back," he said finally. "You'll catch cold in those wet clothes." Willow studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "As will you. Perhaps you could come by the schoolhouse tomorrow. I'd like to thank you properly for what you did today." Against his better judgment, Jake agreed. As he watched her walk up the steps to the Reverend's house where she was staying, he knew he was treading dangerous ground. Willow Edwards represented everything he had avoided for years: connection, community, the possibility of loss. Yet as he turned toward the livery where he'd been sleeping, Jake couldn't deny that for the first time since burying his parents, he felt something other than the familiar emptiness. And that, more than any physical danger, terrified him. The following evening, Jake approached the schoolhouse with uncharacteristic nervousness. He had bathed at the barber shop, shaved his light stubble, and donned his cleanest shirt. Still, he felt out of place as he knocked on the schoolhouse door. Willow opened it, her smile warm and welcoming. "Jake, come in." She was dressed simply but elegantly in a deep blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in a soft coil at the nape of her neck. The schoolroom had been transformed. Desks were pushed to the walls, and a small table in the center held a modest supper for two: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," Jake said, uncomfortable with the effort she had made on his behalf. "It's the least I could do after your heroism yesterday," Willow replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Besides, I seldom have the opportunity to cook a proper meal, living with the Johnsons." As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily than Jake would have expected. Willow asked about his experiences on cattle drives, and he found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years, some humorous, some harrowing, all part of the life he'd chosen after losing his parents. "Do you ever think about settling down?" Willow asked as they finished their meal. "Finding a place to call home again?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. When I pass a homestead at dusk and see a family gathered for supper, or when I wake up cold and alone under the stars." He shrugged. "But then I remember what happens when you let yourself care too much about a place or people." "Your parents," Willow said softly. "They loved their ranch, they loved each other. And they died because of it." Jake met her gaze. "If my father hadn't tried to protect my mother, he might have survived. If they hadn't been so determined to hold onto their land, they might have fled when the raiders came. Or they might still have died, but alone instead of together," Willow countered. "Is survival at any cost really living, Jake?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortable in its truth. Before Jake could form a response, hoofbeats sounded outside, followed by loud voices and the schoolhouse door bursting open. 3 men stood in the doorway, trail-worn and hard-eyed. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, fixed his gaze on Willow. "Found you at last, Miss Edwards," he said, his voice coldly satisfied. "Or should I say Mrs. Blackwell?" Jake stood, positioning himself between Willow and the intruders. "What do you want?" The scarred man barely glanced at him. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy. My business is with the lady." "Any business with her goes through me first," Jake said, his hand moving toward his holster. "Jake, don't," Willow's voice was tight with fear. "Please." The scarred man smirked. "Better listen to her, cowboy. Wouldn't want to die for a woman who's been lying to everyone in this town." Jake didn't take his eyes off the intruders. "I think you should leave." "Not without her," the scarred man said. "See, Mrs. Blackwell here is a runaway wife. Her husband has hired us to bring her back to Philadelphia." Jake felt Willow move closer to him, her hand gripping his arm. "Is that true?" he asked quietly. "My name is Willow Edwards," she said firmly. "I was forced into marriage with Arthur Blackwell when I was 18. He was 30 years my senior and a monster. After 5 years of enduring his cruelty, I fled." Her voice shook slightly. "I will not go back." The scarred man took a step forward. "That's not your choice, ma'am. The law says you belong to your husband." Jake's jaw tightened. "The law doesn't reach this far into the territory. Now get out before I put a bullet in you." The standoff might have erupted into violence if not for the timely arrival of Sheriff Davis, drawn by the commotion. After hearing both sides, he reluctantly acknowledged the bounty hunter's legal right to return Willow to her husband, but insisted they remain in town overnight while he verified their credentials. As the sheriff escorted the bounty hunters to the jail for the night, Jake and Willow were left alone in the schoolhouse, the remains of their dinner forgotten. "I should have told you," Willow said, her composure finally breaking as tears filled her eyes. "But I was afraid you would judge me, afraid you would turn me in." Jake shook his head, still processing the revelation. Why not just get a divorce? Arthur would never allow it. His reputation in Philadelphia society means everything to him. Willow wrapped her arms around herself. And the courts rarely side with wives in these matters, especially when the husband is a prominent businessman with political connections. "So you ran?" "Yes. I took what money I could and fled west, changing my name and hoping to disappear." Willow wiped away a tear. "I was a fool to think I could escape him." Jake paced the small schoolroom, his mind racing. "You can't go back to him." "I have no choice," Willow said, defeat evident in her voice. "Those men will take me by force if necessary, and the law will back them." "There's always a choice," Jake insisted, turning to face her. The thought of Willow being dragged back to an abusive husband was intolerable. Something protective and fierce had awakened in him, something he had thought died with his parents. "We'll leave tonight," he decided. "I know places in the mountains where they'll never find you." Hope flickered in Willow's eyes. "You would do that, risk yourself for me?" "Yes," Jake said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Get whatever you need. Meet me at the livery in an hour." As Willow hurried to gather her belongings from the Reverend's house, Jake prepared for their escape. He purchased supplies from the general store, saddled Ranger, and acquired a second horse, a sturdy mare that could carry Willow through rough terrain. An hour later, as the town settled into darkness, Willow appeared at the livery, dressed in a practical riding skirt and carrying a small bundle of possessions. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as Jake helped her mount the mare. "No," he admitted, "but I'm sure you deserve better than being forced back to a man who hurt you." They slipped out of town under cover of darkness, heading west toward the mountains. Jake knew of an abandoned mining cabin high in a remote valley, difficult to find unless you knew where to look. They could hide there until they figured out a more permanent solution. As they rode through the night, Jake was acutely aware that he had just abandoned his solitary existence for the most dangerous thing of all, caring about someone else's fate more than his own. The realization should have terrified him, but instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. Dawn found them deep in the foothills, stopping briefly to rest the horses beside a small stream. Willow dismounted stiffly, unused to long hours in the saddle. "How are you holding up?" Jake asked, offering her his canteen. "I'll survive," she said with a tired smile. "I'm tougher than I look." "I never doubted that." Jake studied her in the early morning light. Despite her exhaustion, there was a new strength in her bearing, the look of someone who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. "Thank you," Willow said quietly. "Not just for helping me escape, but for believing me, for not judging me." Jake nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "We should keep moving. They'll discover we're gone soon enough." They pushed on through the day, climbing steadily into more rugged terrain. By late afternoon, they reached the hidden valley Jake had described. The mining cabin was crude but solid, with a stone fireplace and a single room furnished with little more than a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. "It's not much," Jake said as he unsaddled the horses, "but it's defensible and there's game and water nearby." Willow looked around the small cabin with undisguised relief. "It's perfect," she declared. "A place they won't think to look." As night fell, Jake built a fire in the fireplace while Willow prepared a simple meal from their supplies. The domesticity of the scene struck Jake as oddly natural, despite the circumstances that had brought them there. "What happens now?" Willow asked as they sat by the fire after eating. Jake stared into the flames. "We wait. Those bounty hunters will search for a while, but eventually they'll either give up or move on to more profitable jobs." "And then?" "And then you decide what you want to do. Where you want to go." Willow was quiet for a long moment. "What about you, Jake? What do you want?" The question caught him off guard. For years, his wants had been simple: survival, solitude, freedom from attachment. But now, looking at Willow in the firelight, he wasn't sure of anything. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "For 3 years, I've been running from ghosts, convincing myself that caring about anyone or anything was a death sentence." "And now," Willow asked softly. Jake met her gaze. "Now I'm wondering if there are some things worth the risk." The moment between them stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Jake stood, breaking the spell. "You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Willow nodded, disappointment flashing briefly in her eyes before she composed herself. "Good night, Jake, and thank you for everything." As Jake settled on his bedroll near the fire, he knew he was standing at a crossroads. For the first time since his parents' deaths, he had chosen to protect someone else, to risk himself for another's welfare. The wall he had built around his heart was crumbling, and he wasn't sure whether to reinforce it or let it fall. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, its lonely cry echoing through the valley. But inside the cabin, Jake was no longer alone, and that reality both terrified and exhilarated him. Days passed in the hidden valley, settling into an unexpected rhythm. Jake hunted and fished, teaching Willow the basics of survival in the wilderness. She proved a quick study, approaching each new skill with determination and intelligence. They took turns at the cabin chores, working side by side to make their temporary refuge more comfortable. Jake repaired the roof while Willow fashioned curtains from spare fabric in her bundle. They gathered wild herbs and berries to supplement their provisions. In the evenings, they talked by the fire, really talked, in a way Jake hadn't done with another person in years. Willow told him about her childhood in Boston, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the arranged marriage that had become her prison. Jake shared stories of his parents, of the ranch they had built, and of the guilt that had driven him to wander after their deaths. "You blamed yourself," Willow observed one night as they sat side by side on a log outside the cabin, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Jake nodded. "I keep thinking that if I'd been there." "You might have died with them," Willow finished gently. "And then where would I be now?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Over the past week, something had grown between them, a connection that went beyond their circumstances, beyond the danger that had thrown them together. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" Jake asked, watching her profile in the fading light. Willow turned to him, her eyes serious. "All the time. I can't go back to Willow Creek, not with those men looking for me. I'll need to move on, find another town, another school perhaps." "Alone?" Her gaze held his. "That depends." Jake looked away first, uncomfortable with the hope he saw in her eyes and felt in his own heart. "We should turn in. Early start tomorrow." That night, as a storm rolled through the mountains, thunder shaking the small cabin, Jake lay awake on his bedroll, listening to Willow's steady breathing from the bed. Lightning illuminated the room in brief flashes, casting everything in stark relief. He had come to a realization over the past days, one he could no longer deny. Despite his determination to remain unattached, he had fallen in love with Willow Edwards. Her courage, her intelligence, her resilience in the face of hardship, Everything about her challenged his belief that love was a weakness. But loving her meant risk. It meant accepting the possibility of loss. It meant choosing vulnerability over safety. And Jake wasn't sure he was brave enough for that choice. Morning brought clear skies and a decision. Jake would ride down to the nearest settlement to gather information and supplies. The bounty hunters might have given up by now, but they needed to be certain before making any plans. "Be careful," Willow said as she helped him saddle Ranger, "if they're still looking." "They won't recognize me," Jake assured her. "I'll just be another cowboy passing through." Before he mounted, Willow laid a hand on his arm. "Promise me you'll come back." The simple request revealed her own fear, that he might decide the risk of staying with her was too great, that he might choose to return to his solitary existence. "I promise," Jake said, covering her hand with his own. The small settlement of Pine Creek was a half-day's ride from their hidden valley. Jake approached cautiously, alert for any sign of the bounty hunters. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of houses, but news traveled fast in such places. At the general store, Jake purchased supplies while listening to the local gossip. He learned that 3 men matching the bounty hunters' descriptions had passed through 2 days earlier, heading east. "Seemed in a foul mood," the storekeeper commented. "Something about losing a trail and wasting their time." Relief washed over Jake. They had given up the search, at least in this area. Perhaps they believed Willow had fled in another direction, or perhaps they had decided the bounty wasn't worth the effort of combing the mountains. His business concluded, Jake mounted Ranger and headed back toward the valley. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities. With the immediate threat gone, he and Willow could decide their next steps. Perhaps they could start fresh somewhere, California, Oregon, or even further north into the territories. Lost in these thoughts, Jake failed to notice the riders following him until they were almost upon him. He cursed his carelessness as he recognized the scarred man and his companions from Willow Creek. "Thought you'd given up," Jake called, reining Ranger to a stop as the 3 men blocked the trail ahead. "Changed our minds when we figured out you'd helped her escape," the scarred man replied. "Figured you'd lead us right to her eventually." Jake's hand moved toward his holster, but the scarred man was faster, his revolver already drawn. "I wouldn't, not unless you want to die right here." "What do you want?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Take us to the woman, and maybe we'll let you live," the scarred man said. "Mrs. Blackwell's husband is offering a substantial reward for her return." Jake's mind raced. If he refused, they would likely kill him and continue searching the mountains until they found Willow. If he appeared to cooperate, he might find an opportunity to turn the tables. "She's not worth dying for," Jake said, infusing his voice with reluctant defeat. "I'll take you to her." The scarred man smiled unpleasantly. "Smart choice, cowboy. Now ride, and remember, we're right behind you with guns drawn." Jake led them toward the valley, but deliberately took a circuitous route, buying time to form a plan. As they approached a narrow pass between 2 rocky slopes, he saw his opportunity. "Pass gets tricky here," he called over his shoulder. "Have to go single file." As he guided Ranger into the narrow passage, Jake loosened a stone in the wall, triggering a small avalanche behind him. The bounty hunters' horses reared in panic as rocks tumbled down, momentarily separating Jake from his pursuers. He spurred Ranger into a gallop, racing toward the cabin to warn Willow. They had perhaps 15 minutes before the bounty hunters cleared the pass and resumed the chase. Willow was outside the cabin when he arrived, her face lighting up at his return before registering his urgency. "They're coming," Jake said, dismounting quickly. "They followed me from town. We need to go now." Willow moved swiftly, gathering only the essentials while Jake saddled her mare. "How far behind you?" "Minutes," Jake replied, checking his ammunition. "We need to reach the high pass before they catch up. If we can get across, we might lose them in the next valley." They rode hard, pushing their mounts up steep trails toward the mountain pass. Jake knew these mountains from his wandering years, and he was counting on that knowledge to save them. As they neared the summit, shots rang out behind them. The bounty hunters had gained ground faster than expected. "Keep going," Jake shouted to Willow. "Don't stop until you reach the other side." He wheeled Ranger around, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. Taking position behind a boulder, Jake prepared to hold off their pursuers long enough for Willow to escape. The first bounty hunter came into view, and Jake fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt just ahead of the man's horse. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. "That's far enough," Jake called. "Next one won't miss." The scarred man appeared, surveying the situation with cold calculation. "3 of us, one of you, Cowboy." "Those aren't good odds." "I only need to hit one of you to even them," Jake replied, his rifle steady. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the scarred man slowly raised his hands. "Let's talk this through. There's no need for bloodshed." Jake wasn't fooled by the sudden reasonableness. "Nothing to talk about. You're going to turn around and ride away." "Can't do that," the scarred man said, "but maybe we can come to an arrangement. Blackwell's offering $500 for his wife's return. I'll split it with you, $250. That's a lot of money for a saddled tramp." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "She's not property to be bought and sold." "She's a wife who ran out on her husband," the scarred man countered. "The law's on our side, not yours." "The law doesn't account for men who beat their wives," Jake said, his voice hard. Something shifted in the scarred man's expression. "Is that what she told you, that he beat her?" He laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Blackwell hired us to bring her back because she tried to kill him. She's wanted for attempted murder, Cowboy." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Could it be true? Had Willow lied to him about her past? His momentary hesitation was all the bounty hunters needed. The scarred man drew and fired in one fluid motion, the bullet grazing Jake's arm. Pain lanced through him as he returned fire, hitting one of the bounty hunters in the shoulder. The firefight escalated, bullets pinging off rocks as Jake tried to maintain his position. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and blood was soaking through his shirt sleeve. A shot from an unexpected direction drew everyone's attention. Willow stood on a ridge above them, a rifle in her hands. She had circled back instead of fleeing. "The next one goes through your head," she called to the scarred man, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Drop your weapons." The standoff might have ended there, if not for the sudden rumble that shook the mountainside. All eyes turned to the slope above them, where recent rains had loosened the soil. The vibrations from their gunfight had triggered a landslide. "Run!" Jake shouted, abandoning his position as tons of earth and rock began to slide toward them. Chaos erupted as everyone scrambled to escape the path of the landslide. Jake lost sight of the bounty hunters in the dust and confusion, his focus solely on reaching Willow. She was already moving, sliding and scrambling down the ridge toward him. They met at the base, grabbing each other's hands as they ran for the horses. The landslide roared behind them, consuming everything in its path. They reached the horses just in time, spurring them away from the danger zone as debris rained down. When they finally stopped, a mile down the trail, they looked back to see the pass completely blocked by the landslide. Of the bounty hunters, there was no sign. "Do you think they made it?" Willow asked, her face pale with shock. Jake shook his head. "I don't know." He turned to her, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded arm. "Why did you come back?" "You should have kept riding." "I couldn't leave you to face them alone," she said simply. Jake studied her face, remembering the scarred man's accusation. "He said you tried to kill your husband. That you're wanted for attempted murder." Willow's expression hardened. "Yes." "After 5 years of enduring his beatings, his humiliation, his control over every aspect of my life, one night when he came at me with a fireplace poker, I took his gun and shot him." Her voice was steady, but tears filled her eyes. "I aimed for his heart, but my hands were shaking. I hit his shoulder instead. He survived. I ran." The truth hung between them, raw and unvarnished. Jake reached out, taking her hand in his. "You were defending yourself." "The law doesn't see it that way," Willow said bitterly. "Not when the husband is Arthur Blackwell, respected businessman and friend to judges and politicians." Jake understood then why she had fled so far, why she had changed her name and hidden in the frontier. It wasn't just about escaping an abusive husband. It was about avoiding a murder charge that would certainly end in her conviction, regardless of the circumstances. "What now?" he asked as they rode slowly down the mountain, the adrenaline of their escape fading. Willow's answer was simple: "We keep running." For 2 months they drifted westward, always alert for pursuit, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention. They took odd jobs where they could, Jake breaking horses or doing ranch work, Willow cooking or sewing for families along the way. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, Jake found himself happier than he had been in years. Willow's presence in his life had awakened something he thought long dead, the capacity for joy, for connection, for hope in the future. They were careful to maintain the appearance of brother and sister to avoid suspicion, but in the privacy of their camp, their relationship deepened. Jake found himself sharing thoughts and dreams he had never voiced aloud, and Willow, in turn, opened up about her hopes for a life free from fear. One evening, as they camped in a meadow beneath the stars, Willow broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "We can't run forever, Jake," she said, stirring the campfire with a stick. "Sooner or later, we need to make a choice about our future." Jake nodded, understanding the crossroads they had reached. "What do you want, Willow?" "If you could have any life, what would it be?" She was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across her face. "I want a home," she said finally, "not just a place but a feeling. Somewhere I belong with someone who sees me for who I truly am." She looked up at him. "What about you?" Jake had asked himself that question countless times over the past weeks. 3 years of wandering, of keeping everyone at arm's length, had left him empty. But Willow had changed that, showing him that there could be more to life than mere survival. "I want the same," he admitted. "A home, a purpose. Someone to share it with." He met her gaze across the fire. "You." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, more powerful for its honesty. Willow's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she moved around the fire to sit beside him. "I love you, Jake Turner," she said quietly. "I think I have, since you risked everything to help me escape." Jake reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "I love you too, Willow Edwards, or Blackwell, or whatever your name really is." "I love you." Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the intensity of feelings long held in check. When they finally broke apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the certainty that this woman, with all her complexities, her courage, her secrets, was meant to be part of his life. "Marry me," he said, the words emerging before he could consider them. "Not as Willow, Blackwell, or Edwards, but as yourself. We'll go somewhere new, somewhere no one knows either of us. We'll start fresh." Willow pulled back slightly, her expression serious. "Jake, I'm still legally married and wanted for attempted murder. Those aren't small obstacles." "I know," he acknowledged, "but there are places where those things matter less. The Northern Territories, maybe, or even across the border into Canada. Somewhere we can build a life without looking over our shoulders." Hope flickered in Willow's eyes, but caution tempered it. "What about your fear, that caring about someone makes you vulnerable?" Jake considered the question, thinking of all they had been through together. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Yes, loving someone means risking loss. But not loving at all, that's the greater loss. My parents understood that. They chose to live fully, to love deeply, even knowing the dangers of the frontier." He took both her hands in his. "I don't want to just survive anymore, Willow. I want to live with you." Tears spilled down Willow's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, yes to all of it, marriage, a fresh start, building a life together. Their decision made, they traveled north, eventually crossing into the Washington Territory. In a small settlement near the Cascade Mountains, they found what they were looking for, a community remote enough to offer anonymity, yet established enough to provide opportunity. Using the last of their savings, Jake purchased a small parcel of land with a modest cabin. The property had been abandoned by a homesteader who had given up on taming the wilderness, but Jake saw its potential: fertile soil in the valley, timber on the slopes, a clear creek running through it. They were married by a circuit preacher who asked few questions about their past. Willow wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Jake stood beside her, clean-shaven and wearing the only good shirt he owned, his heart fuller than he had ever thought possible. As autumn turned to winter, they settled into their new home, working side by side to prepare for the cold months ahead. Jake repaired the cabin's roof and walls, while Willow made it a home inside, creating comfort from the simplest materials. Word spread through the scattered community about the young couple who had moved into the old Peterson place. Jake's skill with horses brought neighbors seeking his help, while Willow's education made her a valuable resource for families wanting their children to learn reading and arithmetic. Slowly, cautiously, they built connections with their neighbors, joining barn raisings and community gatherings, offering help in times of need, accepting assistance when offered. Though they remained vague about their past, they were accepted for who they were now, hardworking, honest, and kind. As winter deepened, bringing long evenings by the fire, Jake and Willow talked about their dreams for the future. They planned to expand the cabin in the spring, to clear more land for crops, perhaps to add a few head of cattle to their small herd. "Do you ever regret it?" Willow asked one night as they lay together in the bed Jake had built with his own hands. "Giving up your freedom to settle here with me?" Jake drew her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I wasn't free before," he said. "I was trapped by fear, by guilt, by the belief that I didn't deserve happiness. You freed me from that, Willow." She nestled against him, her voice sleepy. "As you freed me." Spring brought new beginnings, tender green shoots in the garden Willow had planted, a foal born to their mare, and the news that Willow was expecting a child of her own. "Are you happy?" Jake asked as they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Willow smiled, placing his hand over her still flat stomach where their child grew. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." In that moment, Jake knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not in endless wandering, but in the love of this remarkable woman and the family they were creating together. The frontier had taken much from both of them. It had claimed his parents and their ranch, had driven Willow to desperate measures to escape her abusive husband. But it had also brought them together, forging a bond through shared hardship and mutual respect that neither could have found elsewhere. As darkness fell over their small homestead, Jake and Willow Turner stood hand in hand, no longer running from the past, but looking forward to the future they would build together in the wilderness they had come to call home. The young cowboy who once believed that the frontier was no place for love, and the mysterious woman who had fled across a continent seeking freedom, had found something neither expected. A love strong enough to heal their wounds, brave enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and nourishing enough to sustain them through all the seasons of their lives.